Morning. Welcome to another lecture in DWC 101. This is going to be a lecture on Plato's Apology of Socrates and also an introduction to the class of individual that Socrates was thought to be while he was alive, namely the Sophists. But first to the background of Plato's Apology of Socrates. It was in the spring of 399 that an Athenian named Meletus made use of his right as an Athenian citizen and entered a general charge against Socrates in the courts. The charge entered against Socrates was impiety, a failure to honor the gods, and the punishment recommended by the plaintiff was death. Socrates was convicted of this charge in a jury of about 500 citizen jurors and put to death by a method of execution that was common in ancient Greece, the drinking of hemlock, a plant with toxins that lead to cardiac arrest. Now, at the time of his trial, Socrates was a very well-known figure even beyond Athens. When he was 45 years old, in 424 before Common Era, the comic playwright Aristophanes featured him as the main character in a play called The Clouds. In this play, Socrates is represented as a typical exemplar of a certain type of intellectual that we find in the 5th century BCE, a person who investigates all questions and claims knowledge of them. In other words, a sophist, which in Greek just really means a wise person, a knower. In particular, Socrates is portrayed in that comedy by Aristophanes as the head of a kind of boarding school for adults, a college professor, if you will. Socrates and his students were represented in this play as dirty, pale, and ascetic, so not engaging in pleasures, and enduring hunger and cold. It was a typical kind of behavior for people who came from Sparta, which was Athens' enemy at the time. Now, Aristophanes depicted the curriculum of the school of Socrates to consist in subjects like astronomy and meteorology. The students are constantly looking up, so that's why the title of the play is The Clouds. And the chorus of the clouds are literally some clouds. Socrates is also depicted as having taught geology, geography, and geometry in that play. But the most important skill he's said to possess is a particular one from rhetoric, the skill of making the weaker argument the stronger one. This is the ability to make what in fact seems less true seem more true, and what seems more true seem less true. After his indictment and execution, Socrates arguably became much more famous than he was in life, and his defense speech at his trial became the subject of much literature. We actually have different versions of the defense speech. The technical term for a defense speech in Greek is an apologia, which doesn't mean apology in our sense of the word. So let me go over to my presentation now. The presentation is called Socrates is Not Sorry, just to make sure that you understand that this is not an apology. In Greek, an apologia is a defense speech, and Plato's Apology of Socrates is a kind of docudrama which presents only fictional speeches by Socrates in defense, but does include some historical context. The speeches were probably composed after Socrates' death, and what they obviously don't do is ward off the penalty of death. It's too late for that. But probably these speeches, as they were written by Plato, were addressed at a wider audience, a posthumous audience, at least posthumous of Socrates, and have the purpose of saving his reputation. As you remember from our reading of Homer's Odyssey, somebody's posthumous fame is really important for their happiness in the afterlife, and maybe Plato thought that he could help Socrates in this way. Now, we actually have two versions of the Apology, as I said. One which was written by Plato, the famous Athenian philosopher and founder of the Academy, which you could maybe think of as the first kind of learning institution, and another written by Xenophon, the military commander and historian. These two apologies tell actually very different stories of what happened at Socrates' trial. On the account of Xenophon, Socrates alienated the jury by appearing arrogant and was ineffective in meeting the accusation that he actually damaged the city by engaging in philosophy. Xenophon says that Socrates actually wanted to be convicted and executed since he believed that he would soon suffer the afflictions of old age and just wanted to get life over with. Now, like much of what Plato wrote, Plato's apology is quite different. It is a literary masterpiece, which means that it probably is not something like a historical document of what Socrates actually said at his trial, even though the apology is written as a series of defense speeches. So that's why I'm calling it a docudrama, because it's probably not giving you the actual words of Socrates, but it is giving you, as it were, a reenactment of what Socrates could have said. Now, other works of Plato explicitly put speech attributed to certain individuals indirectly, so that it's clear that the speech has been reported by someone else, but Plato's apology doesn't do this, so that's why it's a docudrama as well. It just goes straight forward and gives you, as it were, Socrates' straight words, which were probably not Socrates' straight words. Plato's apology consists of three major parts. The first part states and answers the charges that were leveled against Socrates. In the second speech, he has already been condemned and he enters a plea regarding the penalty. And then in the third and most brief part, there are some final remarks which are reflections on his penalty, which was death. Now, this format of the apology actually corresponds to a kind of climax structure. It starts out in the first part being very much in the historical context of the trial. The second part, which is much shorter, actually goes into why Socrates should not be punished at all, but why he actually deserves some gratitude from the city. And the third part is addressed to a very universal audience and basically includes some reflections on what it means for Athens to have put Socrates to death. Now, here are the charges that Socrates faced. First charge is Socrates commits harms in the eye of the law and that he engages in superfluous research on divine things above the earth, and by making the weaker argument the stronger and teaching others to do so. So with this charge, he's being associated with the sophists very clearly, and he's basically, this was not any sort of unique charge to Socrates. This was a suspicion that had already been directed against philosophers such as Anaxagoras, who was a friend of Pericles, about 30 years earlier. So this was a kind of typical charge that you made against an intellectual, basically doubting their piety. The second charge says that Socrates commits harms in the eye of the law by corrupting the youth. And the third charge was that Socrates teaches not to recognize the gods the city recognizes, and he introduces new divinities. Now, in his defense, as crafted by Plato, so probably not as actually given by Socrates, there are some very typical elements of forensic rhetoric. Forensic rhetoric is the kind of rhetoric that you find in a legal context. So it was very typical of rhetoric at the time to deny that you have any rhetorical skill and to impute rhetorical skill to the opponent. So when Socrates begins this way, that's actually a very characteristic element of rhetoric. And maybe we can just read that part. in the translation that I've selected, which is the translation by the great Victorian British Plato scholar Benjamin Jowett, Socrates says this. But of the many falsehoods told by them, there was one which quite amazed me. I mean when they said that you should be on your guard and not allow yourself to be deceived by the force of my eloquence. To say this, when they were certain to be detected as soon as I opened my lips and proved myself to be anything but a great speaker, did indeed appear to me most shameless, unless by the force of eloquence they mean the force of truth. For if such is their meaning, I admit that I am eloquent. Now, this is a very crafty way to begin a speech because of course, you are adjusting people's expectations, and as soon as somebody thinks, oh, well, that wasn't so well said, then you're in fact showing them that you're not so interested in speaking well or being eloquent. What you're interested in is only the truth. Now, this is a very skillful positioning of Socrates at the very beginning of his speech. And of course, people often do this in public speeches by beginning with some sort of self-deprecating remark. The specific technical term that they have for rhetoric is captatio benevolentiae. That's capturing the goodwill of your audience right at the outset. After that, Socrates goes into a narration of what he thinks the real motivation is behind the charges. Namely, he goes back to the reputation that he got several years earlier from pieces like the Clouds of Aristophanes, and tries to defeat two sets of charges, old charges and new charges. And that's basically the transition to the citation of the charges. Now, there are some elements of the defense which are very atypical of forensic rhetoric, and it's because of these elements that we can be pretty sure that the speech didn't happen this way. One of the elements which would have just been completely unheard of in a typical Greek trial would be to cite your accusers as witnesses. This was actually part of the typical Socratic method of dialectic, but it was not at all part of the Athenian legal procedure. So that would have been just an almost unimaginable piece of evidence to enter into such a trial. Another element that's actually quite extraordinary for this kind of a procedure is the inclusion of theological and eschatological elements. And what I mean by that are all these reflections on the afterlife. Socrates basically introduces a kind of theory of goods and the afterlife to tell the jurors what it would even mean to condemn somebody to death, and why they should, how they should think of death and how they should think of life. And in this, the speech is also protreptic. And by protreptic, I mean it's something that tries to change the attitude or moral outlook of the listeners. Now, in defense to the first claim, or first two claims, Socrates says the following. And these things were very typical claims that we find Socrates making also in other Platonic texts. First, he denies that he commits harms in the eye of the law by teaching certain things about the stars and divinities. Firstly, because he makes no claim to be wise. He says, I make no claim to be wise because I have no positive doctrines and do not claim to be a teacher. But I am wise in a relative sense, that is, insofar as I know that I know nothing, whereas others mistakenly think that they know something. This is Socrates' famous disavowal of knowledge, his claim that he knows that he doesn't know. Now, it's understandable that people who had heard things about Socrates and claims about the things he was talking about would disagree with him, especially because he was known primarily for refuting people. that is, for showing that certain people were wrong. And so it's legitimate, one could think, to expect that Socrates knows at least something if he goes around refuting people all the time. We'll get to this point a little later. The second charge was that Socrates commits harms in the eye of the law by corrupting the youth. And there he enters another typical Socratic thesis. And by a thesis, I mean something that actually is quite controversial, by saying that no one ever voluntarily does a harm, knowing that there will be retribution for that harm. And because that is so, I either committed no wrong or I harmed involuntarily. Now, that's a pretty controversial claim, actually. It seems that people voluntarily do harms all the time, even knowing that they could be punished for them. And we think of that as weakness of will or just plain old moral weakness. Socrates actually had the interesting but problematic idea that this sort of action is impossible. And he wanted to say it was impossible because the idea was that if you could knowingly go against what you know to be morally right, then the knowledge of moral rightness would be a trivial thing, something that you could override. That was the thesis that we hear reported later from Aristotle that Socrates had as well. So this is a defense, is not a very effective defense, of course, because it's actually entering a very controversial claim in his own defense. The third charge was that Socrates teaches not to recognize the gods. The city recognizes and introduces new divinities. And notice, this is not a claim about what he believes. It's a claim about what he actually, to what he actually pays homage. And according to the Platonic dialogues, and that's most of the evidence that we have, Socrates was actually quite a dutiful citizen in that he offered sacrifices to the gods of the city. This was a very important kind of institutional framework for religion, and it wasn't about what you believed. It was more about what you did. Against this claim, he responds, "You claim that I do not recognize gods and that I recognize new gods. This statement involves the contradiction. Socrates recognizes gods and Socrates does not recognize gods." So, of course, this is again probably in the context not a very good defense at all, but it is an interesting argument. It's a so-called self-refutation argument. His claim is that those who both claim that he recognizes gods and claim that he does not recognize gods are contradicting themselves and thus have already refuted themselves. This is probably a little bit too subtle for 500 citizen jurors in the year 399 BC, so one could understand again why perhaps Socrates was not acquitted of this charge. He could have simply pointed to all the occasions on which he sacrificed to gods of the city, or all his participation in public festivals, or he could have cited witnesses to give testimony to that effect, but he didn't do that. Instead, he entered, at least according to Plato, he entered this self-refutation argument, which would have been probably not so effective for the audience that there was at that time. So if Plato's defense of Socrates, his apology of Socrates, has any likeness whatsoever to the speech that Socrates actually gave, it was probably to be expected that he would be condemned to death. Now, there is one element of the Socratic method as we find it in many Platonic dialogues that we find in the passage where he cross-examines his own accusers. And that's this procedure in which you examine someone who thinks that she knows something. And if she can answer questions on the topic of X, whatever that topic is, without contradicting herself, she does know something. But if she can't, she doesn't know something. And this procedure is pretty, well, it operates on some assumptions. One is a logical assumption, and that is that anybody who contradicts herself or himself is involved in a kind of self-refutation. So, and that seems to be a little problematic because, look, it's possible for people to become confused or to entertain things that might contradict each other, but they haven't thought about the contradiction yet. And maybe if they thought about the reasons for their views, they would reject one of those things. It's not clear that somebody is completely ignorant just because they engage in a self-contradiction, but still showing that somebody was engaged in self-contradiction was a very effective way to shame somebody out of holding the views that were in contradiction. And that's why the Greek word for a refutation, namely elenkos, could also mean, in ancient Greek, a shaming. So what Socrates was doing with people in actually making them contradict themselves through discussions was a kind of shaming procedure. And it's not so surprising that he made some enemies through doing that with people. There's another assumption about this procedure, and that's a so-called epistemological assumption. That means, and it's an assumption that has to do with knowledge, and the idea here is that if you refute yourself by contradicting yourself, you don't know something. And as I was just saying, it's completely possible for someone to actually know quite a lot of things and be certain of a lot of things, and still in oral conversation, in oral argument, say things that can be put together as contradictory. Now, before I go over to some discussion questions, I just want to think a little bit with you about Socrates and the jury. As I said, Plato's Apology consists of three major parts. A first speech in which Socrates defends himself against the charge that he's engaged in impious activities. A second speech in which he holds after the jury has already voted to indict him, and in which he proposes his penalty. And a third speech, which is not part of the formal proceedings, in which Socrates addresses the jury. Now, in order to better understand the structure of the apology, it'll be useful first to say something about how such a trial worked. In Athens, legal cases fell into two basic categories: a graphe, which was a general charge, and a dike, which was a charge for damages. In a graphe, any citizen could bring a specific charge of wrongdoing. In a dike, only the victim of an alleged crime or the nearest male relative could charge another with having illegally caused harm. Now, Socrates was a case of graphe. It may seem odd to many readers today that Socrates is given the opportunity to speak after he's been indicted. This has to do with the fact that some graphi, some of these general charges, carried fixed penalties, whereas others did not. A procedure in which there was no fixed penalty was called an agotimetas. Agotimetas, so that means a procedure to be evaluated. In a case of this sort, the law required that the jury decide what the defendant deserved to suffer or pay by choosing between the penalty suggested by the plaintiff and the one suggested by the defendant. So that's why Socrates gives a speech about how he should be punished. It's very important to understand this feature of the law in order to understand the audacity of Socrates' apology as a defense. His accuser, Meletus, had proposed that Socrates be put to death for corrupting the youth. In the second speech, Socrates proposes that he instead be punished by receiving meals in the Prytaneum, a state institution of Athens where a kind of executive committee of the city council met. To receive meals or maintenance at the Prytaneum for the rest of one's life was a special honor conferred only on athletes who won at the Olympic Games. So by suggesting this, Socrates was actually forcing the hand of the jury to vote for death, since the alternative was too preposterous and would have struck most Athenians as also very wasteful. So much to the background. Now to the three speeches which make up the Apology. The first speech gives a defense against the accusation that Socrates corrupts the youth and does not believe in the gods of the state, but obviously it also does more than that. It's also a justification of both a form of life and a specific kind of intellectual pursuit which came with it, but only after Socrates' lifetime, and in good part due to Plato, it became known as philosophy. Now, what we today call ancient philosophy actually goes back to figures who lived over 100 years before Socrates and came from Eastern Greece. The prototypical wise person in Greek culture, Thales, who was kind of their Einstein, who lived in Miletus and is said by Herodotus to have predicted an eclipse that occurred around 585 before Common Era. These people did not, as far as we know, consider themselves philosophers. But in modern histories of ancient philosophy, such figures as Thales are given first. Now, we don't have any fragments of what Thales wrote, but we do have reports of his theories, which were about the shape of the cosmos and the composition of the natural world. We know of many other thinkers who wrote on these topics after Thales, and we even have some fragments of their works, which at this time, in the 6th century BCE or 500s, were more or less all had the same title. They all wrote works on nature. In the 5th century, this changes. The intellectual pursuits of Greek intellectuals turn more to a study of arguments and practices of persuasion, which are very important for new forms of self-government arising in these times, democracy, and the direct governance of the community through an assembly of all citizens and a randomly selected council for the administration of the city. The development in particular of a legal system in which each citizen had to represent himself and the non-citizen members of his household made the ability to argue and speak persuasively a good for which wealthy citizens were prepared to pay high prices. And this gave rise to the kind of sophist that Socrates was accused of being. The people who taught such courses in public speaking were called sophists. And in his defense, Plato has Socrates distinguish himself very clearly from these people, all the while speaking in a very eloquent way, which was typical of sophists. Sophists charged high prices for their instruction. Socrates points out that he does not take money for his teaching, and more importantly, that he does not teach. This is the sense behind Socrates' disavowal of knowledge, his professed ignorance. If Socrates can successfully claim not to know anything, then he'll be vindicated of the charge of being a sophist. For the Greek word sophist comes from the adjective sophos and just means wise, as I told you a while ago. So if he can plausibly deny being wise, he can avoid the charge of teaching wisdom. His wisdom lies rather in knowing what he does not know. His mission is to disabuse others of the belief that they are wise. Now, as an example of Socrates' practice of refutation, you find this in the Apology itself. It features as a kind of cross-examination of the people who are prosecuting him, as we've seen. And this was, in fact, a part of regular court proceedings in ancient Athens, but normally litigants would cite multiple witnesses. In citing only his accuser, Socrates is depicted here as doing something basically unheard of in Athenian litigation, as I mentioned, using the prosecution as a witness for the defense. Socrates' style of argument and dialogue, which would later be called dialectic, became a kind of craze among the Athenian elite, who began to imitate it. Many people wrote Socratic dialogues after Socrates' death. Socrates himself seems to never have written anything, but we only have a few of these. Luckily, we have all the dialogues written by Plato and one set of dialogues, or one series of dialogues from Xenophon featuring Socrates. The ones by Xenophon are probably more historical than the ones by Plato, but those by Plato are highly literary and most likely not conceived as records of historical events. So I want to close with some questions. These are general questions that relate to the handout that I've given you. And I hope that you have enjoyed this lecture on Plato's Apology of Socrates. If you have any questions, feel free to write me, and I hope to see you soon.